If you look at the New World Order, it's probably not a surprise if you take a long-term view, because back in the 1700s, both China and India were global leaders in terms of world trade. It was over that 50-year period following the Industrial Revolution that Western Europe, the US, started to take dominance. But you can see that those lines are now crossing and that China and India are coming back into their own. So it's more a cycle than has previously been acknowledged, I suspect. So the last trend, internationalisation of the experience for students. So there's a demand for international or virtual experiences for students. So at Monash, we're very focused on student mobility, particularly for undergraduate students with study abroad and student exchange, and we've put a lot of effort into increasing the number of students who have the opportunity to go abroad. But increasingly, we're also looking at HDR students, because it's also important that they have an international research experience, because many of them will actually go and work in labs offshore. So they need to be able to adjust to a new lab, adjust to a culture. So it's critical that we have our HDR students with this international experience. But increasingly, we're also looking at transnational e-tutorials with some of our partners, again, to try to build these cross-cultural teams and being able to work virtually. Because as we saw with the statistics that were presented this morning, many of our international students actually expect to work for multinational companies. And these sorts of skills are essential for them to be successful in that multicultural and global environment. And Monash is in quite a unique position that we can assist our students to develop those skills, because to actually work across the Monash network, across the footprint of our campuses, staff and students have to be able to cope with this environment. And I've said this before, but it surprised me when I came to Monash a little over a year ago that this institution was so internationalised from the very inside. And I think people who've worked here for a long time just take it for granted. Monash is quite unique in terms of its international perspective compared to any of the other GO8, certainly. And I don't think we should take it for granted. And the experience that our students will have by working with staff who are globally, that have this global outlook, I think it can't help but have a very positive impact on their employability. So there's a changed regional education landscape. There's increased competition due to the increased supply of high quality education providers. So not only within the region but also within Australia. We now have Carnegie Mellon in Adelaide. University College London are also looking at Adelaide to set up. So there are a number of high quality education institutions that are coming to Australia to compete for our students. It's not only that we've gone into Malaysia or into South Africa to compete for students, the same thing is starting to happen in Australia. There's reduced demand for fee-paying international students with an increase of high-quality domestic education providers at home. And there's also an increase in online providers. And I think the equivalent of Phoenix, where they go for what they call the low-hanging fruit of education, that they are able to roll out these mass education degree programs. It's not that Monash wants to go in that direction, but there is increased competition in that particular sector. And there's also demand from students for greater flexibility in both time and distance in this virtual world. So the podcast of the lecture, if a student can't make it to a lecture, they've got a backup. If they're having difficulty understanding the lecture, they can revise. So my last point is about potential collaboration in ICT in our international education. So educational ICT collaboration is possible with our non-Australian campuses, and there are examples of this occurring already, but I think there's greater potential for that to occur between our Australian campuses and our Malaysian and our South African campuses in the form of shared lectures, podcast, and also real-time lectures through video conferencing. We can have joint e-tutorials. We can set assignments where a group of students from Malaysia might combine with some of our students from Australia and from South Africa. So it doesn't mean that we're limited to a particular space for students to collaborate. So Monash, I would suggest, needs to invest in ICT innovations that provide two things. Firstly, a robust backbone for ongoing ICT requirements, but as well I'd suggest that we also invest in what we call discontinuous innovation. So we've heard today that there are a number of systems that we've been able to roll out across the university. And looking at Lotus Notes, we're looking at these big rollouts that take a lot of time, a lot of training of staff, very expensive. So that's necessary, but it doesn't mean that we can't be involved in discontinuous innovation. So younger people are expecting 24/7, they're expecting innovation, they're expecting to be stimulated. So it's possible to introduce an innovation that might only have a shelf life of a year or of 18 months. Not particularly expensive to roll out, but you accept that it has a short time frame. So it's not an either or. It's actually, we need to do both. So that's where I'd like to leave it before lunch. We've got 3/4 of an hour for lunch, so we're going to reconvene at 1:15. I don't know whether there are any questions. Perhaps if there are questions, we might be able to deal with them later in the day. So I don't want to keep you from your lunch. So thank you very much.